The massive drill bits scraped against ancient stone as the Vorthak archaeological team worked under the blazing twin suns of planet Xerion 7. Commander Thexel supervised the operation with his 4 muscular arms crossed, his reptilian eyes focused on the excavation site. After 3 months of careful digging through layers of crystallized sand and fossilized debris, they had finally reached the buried temple that their orbital scans had detected. Dr. Kim Jisoo wiped sweat from her forehead as she documented each artifact they uncovered. As the only human on this joint expedition, she felt the weight of representing her entire species. The other alien archaeologists were brilliant, but they sometimes missed the subtle details that human intuition could catch. She had been studying ancient civilizations for 15 years, but nothing had prepared her for what they were about to discover. The crystalline jewel emerged from its resting place, like a sleeping giant awakening. It was roughly the size of a human head, with faceted surfaces that seemed to shift and change color depending on the angle of view. Even before the cleaning process began, everyone could see that this was no ordinary gemstone. Energy patterns danced beneath its surface like captured lightning, and it gave off a faint humming sound that seemed to resonate in their bones. Thexel immediately called for the portable laboratory equipment to be brought to the excavation site. Within hours, 7 different species of alien scientists had gathered around the artifact, each bringing their most advanced technological tools. The Vorthak used their psionic amplifiers, devices that could read and manipulate thought patterns across vast distances. The crystalline beings known as the Silthrax attempted to interface with the jewel using bioresonance fields that matched the natural vibrations of living crystal formations. Dr. Kim watched as each species took their turn. The gaseous nebulons tried to communicate with the artifact using harmonic frequencies that could shatter mountains. The insectoid Zakri used their hive-mind neural networks to probe the jewel's consciousness. Even the highly advanced Morvani, whose technology was thousands of years ahead of human development, failed to get any response from the mysterious relic. "This makes no sense," muttered Thexel after the 5th failed attempt. His normally steady voice carried a note of frustration that his translator struggled to convey. "Our equipment shows massive energy readings, but we cannot access whatever power source drives this artifact." The news of their discovery spread through the galactic communication network faster than light itself. Within 12 hours, diplomatic messages were flooding in from across the known galaxy. Ancient civilizations that rarely spoke to each other suddenly found common ground in their recognition of the jewel. The Morvani Elder Council transmitted copies of texts that were older than human recorded history, speaking of a Genesis stone that held the power to reshape reality itself. The silicon-based crystallites, who normally communicated only in mathematical equations, sent emotional messages describing their legends of the Shard of Beginning, a cosmic artifact that their ancestors claimed could unlock the secrets of creation. Even the mysterious Void Dwellers, beings who lived in the empty spaces between stars, emerged from their isolation to share stories of a heart of all things that appeared in their oldest memory crystals. Each message that arrived made it clear that this discovery was far more significant than anyone had initially realized. Dr. Kim found herself at the center of a growing storm of galactic politics as different species began claiming historical rights to the artifact. Some demanded immediate access for their own scientific teams, while others suggested that the jewel should be moved to a neutral location for joint study. The human research station that orbited Xerion 7 suddenly became the most important location in the galaxy. Diplomatic vessels from dozens of different civilizations began arriving daily, their strange shapes creating a bizarre traffic pattern around the small outpost. Dr. Kim had to move her family quarters to a more secure section of the station, as the population swelled from 50 researchers to over 300 beings from across known space. Her 11-year-old son, Park Min-ho, spent hours pressed against the observation deck windows, watching the incredible variety of alien spacecraft dock with their station. Each vessel was a masterpiece of engineering from its respective civilization, and Min-ho tried to identify each species based on the pictures in his xenobiology textbooks. His mother had strictly forbidden him from wandering the station during this tense period, but the boy's natural curiosity grew stronger with each passing day. The diplomatic meetings that followed were unlike anything in galactic history. A species that had been enemies for centuries found themselves working together, united by their shared desire to unlock the secrets of the mysterious jewel that continued to pulse with unknown power. The heated voices from the diplomatic summit echoed through the corridors of the research station as representatives from 23 different alien civilizations argued over who had the rightful claim to study the mysterious jewel. Dr. Kim Jisoo sat at the massive conference table, trying to mediate between species that had been at war for centuries. The Vortic delegation demanded immediate access, claiming their archaeological team had discovered the artifact. The Morvani countered that their ancient texts gave them historical precedence. Meanwhile, the Crystallites insisted that only beings made of living crystal could truly understand the relic's nature. Young Park Min-ho pressed his ear against the wall of their family quarters, listening to the angry sounds that seemed to shake the entire station. His mother had been in those meetings for 6 straight hours, and he was getting incredibly bored. The station's other human children had been moved to different sections for security reasons, leaving him completely alone with nothing but his schoolwork and some old holographic games. During their 3-month stay on the station, Min-ho had explored every public area dozens of times. He knew which maintenance shafts led to the observation decks, which service tunnels connected the different levels, and most importantly, he had memorized the daily routines of every technician and security guard. His mother always said he was too curious for his own good, but Min-ho preferred to think of himself as naturally observant. The laboratory where they kept the jewel was supposed to be completely off-limits to everyone except the senior research team. Multiple security barriers protected the room, including biometric scanners and quantum locks that could theoretically keep out even the most advanced alien infiltration technology. But Min-ho had noticed something that the adults had missed in their complex security arrangements. Every morning at exactly 0800 station time, Technician Rodriguez would arrive to calibrate the atmospheric processors that kept the laboratory environment stable. Min-ho had watched him punch in the access code so many times that he had memorized the entire sequence. The man always looked around nervously before entering, as if he was afraid of being watched, but he never thought to check the small ventilation grate positioned directly above the door panel. As the diplomatic arguments grew louder and more heated, Min-ho made his decision. His mother would be stuck in those meetings for hours, and the security guards were all focused on protecting the conference hall from potential alien infiltrators. Nobody would be paying attention to one human child moving through the maintenance areas of the station. The journey through the service tunnels took longer than expected. The passages were designed for maintenance robots, not 11-year-old boys, and Min-ho had to crawl on his hands and knees through several sections. His school clothes were completely dirty by the time he reached the laboratory level, but the excitement of his adventure made him forget about the discomfort. The laboratory door stood before him like a gateway to another world. Min-ho could hear the faint humming of alien equipment through the thick metal barriers, and he could see the soft glow of the jewel's energy through the small observation window. His heart was beating so fast that he worried the sound might trigger some kind of security system, but he forced himself to stay calm as he entered the access code he had memorized. The door slid open with a quiet hiss, revealing the most incredible sight Min-ho had ever witnessed. The jewel sat in the center of the room like a captured piece of the universe itself, surrounded by dozens of alien devices that hummed and beeped in complex rhythms. The artifact was even more beautiful up close than it had appeared through the observation windows. Colors that had no names in any human language swirled beneath its crystalline surface, creating patterns that seemed to tell stories of distant worlds and forgotten civilizations. Without really thinking about what he was doing, Min-ho walked forward until he was standing directly in front of the jewel. The alien equipment around him registered his presence with soft chirping sounds, but none of the devices seemed designed to stop human children from approaching the artifact. The adults had been so focused on preventing alien infiltration that they had never considered the possibility of a curious human child simply walking into the room. The jewel's surface was perfectly smooth and warm to the touch, like glass that had been sitting in sunlight. The moment Min-ho's fingertips made contact with the crystalline structure, everything changed in an instant that seemed to last forever. Light exploded outward from the artifact with such intensity that it seemed to pierce through the station's hull and reach into the depths of space itself. The energy surge was so powerful that every piece of electronic equipment in the laboratory either overloaded or began displaying impossible readings. Holographic projections materialized around the jewel, showing star maps of galaxies that human astronomers had never discovered and mathematical equations that described the fundamental structure of reality in ways that hurt to comprehend. The shockwave of energy traveled through the station's superstructure, causing lights to flicker and emergency alarms to sound in distant sections. In the conference hall, every alien delegate fell silent as their instruments detected the massive power surge. Dr. Kim felt her breath catch in her throat as she realized that the energy signature was coming from the direction of the laboratory, where her son was supposed to be safely confined to their quarters. She ran through the corridors faster than she had ever moved in her life, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. When the laboratory door opened, she found Minho standing calmly beside the now brilliantly glowing artifact, completely unharmed but somehow fundamentally changed. His eyes reflected the same ethereal light as the jewel itself, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that should have been impossible for any human throat to produce. "Mom," he said, looking at her with an expression of profound understanding. That seemed far too old for his young face. "I can see everything now. I can see who we really are and where we came from. We're not what anyone thinks we are." The moment Minho's consciousness merged with the ancient jewel, reality itself seemed to bend and reshape around him. Information flooded through his young mind like water breaking through a dam, but instead of overwhelming him, it felt like coming home after a very long journey. The artifact began projecting three-dimensional images that filled the entire laboratory, creating a holographic theater that showed the true history of the human species. Dr. Kim gasped as she watched scenes of Earth from millions of years ago. Long before the first ice age had ever touched the planet, the world looked completely different then, with vast cities that floated above crystal-clear oceans and transportation systems that moved people through streams of pure energy. Humans who looked remarkably similar to modern people, yet somehow more refined and graceful, moved through these ancient civilizations with technology that seemed like magic. "This can't be real," she whispered. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew she was looking at genuine historical records. The detail was too perfect, too consistent, and too alien in its perspectives to be any kind of fabrication. These weren't human fantasies or dreams, but actual documentation of events that had taken place when Earth was young. The holographic display showed ancient humans building massive ships that could travel between stars without any visible means of propulsion. They terraformed entire planets by somehow convincing the worlds themselves to change their atmospheric composition and gravitational fields. Most incredible of all, they seemed to communicate with each other through methods that didn't require speech or any kind of technology, as if their minds were naturally connected across vast distances. Commander Thexel and his Vorthak delegation had forced their way into the laboratory despite all security protocols. But now they stood frozen in shock as they watched the historical projections. The proud warrior species had always believed themselves to be among the galaxy's oldest and most advanced civilizations, but the images showed ancient humans accomplishing feats that the Vorthak still considered impossible even with their most advanced technology. "Your species built Dyson spheres around entire star systems," Thexel said in a voice barely above a whisper. "You moved planets from one solar system to another like they were small toys. Our greatest engineering projects are nothing compared to what your ancestors achieved as routine daily activities." The Morvani delegates, beings of pure energy who rarely showed emotion, began pulsing with colors that indicated deep amazement and something approaching fear. Their own civilization was over 50,000 years old, and they had always prided themselves on being the galaxy's most ancient culture. But the holographic records showed human civilizations that predated them by millions of years, with technologies that made Morvani science look primitive by comparison. As more alien representatives crowded into the laboratory, the jewel continued, revealing layer after layer of forgotten human history. The ancient humans hadn't just been advanced in technology, they had achieved something that no other known species had ever accomplished. They had learned to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions, experiencing reality on levels that other beings couldn't even imagine. But the most shocking revelation came when the jewel showed what had happened to these incredible ancestors. They hadn't been destroyed by war or natural disaster. They had simply outgrown physical existence entirely, one by one, and then in great waves, they had transcended their material bodies and moved into higher dimensional planes where they could exist as pure consciousness and energy. Before departing the physical universe, however, they had done something unprecedented. They had encoded all of their knowledge, their memories, and their technological understanding into the genetic structure of their own species. Every human being carried within their DNA the complete blueprint of the most advanced civilization the galaxy had ever known. But this information could only be accessed under very specific conditions. Minho, still glowing with the jewel's energy, turned to face the crowd of amazed aliens and spoke in that strange harmonic voice that seemed to come from multiple dimensions at once. They made it so only human children could unlock the knowledge, he explained. Adult minds become too rigid, too set in their ways to accept truths that seem impossible. But children haven't learned yet what's supposed to be impossible. The implications hit everyone in the room like a physical blow. Every human child in the galaxy was potentially a living repository of technological and scientific knowledge that could revolutionize civilization. The jewel hadn't just awakened because a human touched it. It had awakened because a human child touched it with the natural openness and wonder that adults lose as they grow older. As if responding to this revelation, reports began flooding in from across the galaxy. Human children on distant colonies were suddenly displaying abilities that defied explanation. 7-year-old Lee Damon on the Mars research station had somehow repaired a quantum computer by simply laying his hands on it and thinking about how it should work. 10-year-old Choi Naeon on Europa had started speaking in mathematical languages that described the fundamental forces of the universe in ways that made veteran physicists weep with joy. The pattern was consistent everywhere humans had settled. Children between the ages of 5 and 12 were manifesting abilities that their ancient ancestors had once considered normal parts of daily life. They could manipulate matter at the molecular level, communicate telepathically across interstellar distances, and perceive dimensions of reality that existed beyond normal space and time. Dr. Kim watched her son with a mixture of pride and terror, as she realized that humanity wasn't just one of many young species struggling to find their place in the galaxy. They were the direct descendants of beings who had once been gods among the stars, and their children were beginning to remember powers that had been sleeping in human genetics for millions of years. The question now wasn't whether humans belonged among the galaxy's advanced civilizations, but whether the rest of the galaxy was ready for humanity to reclaim its true heritage as the universe's first and greatest spacefaring species. The emergency communication from Mars Colony arrived at Dr. Kim's research station just 3 hours after Minho had first touched the ancient jewel. The message was frantic and barely coherent, transmitted by a colony administrator who sounded like he was witnessing something that challenged his understanding of reality itself. "We need immediate assistance," the voice crackled through the interstellar communication array. "One of our children, Lee Inha, she's doing things that shouldn't be possible. She's making objects float without touching them, and not just small things. She lifted a construction vehicle yesterday like it weighed nothing at all." Similar reports began flooding in from every human settlement across the galaxy. On Europa, the ice mining colony reported that 7-year-old Choi Daeho had suddenly started speaking in complex mathematical formulas that described how to manipulate the fundamental forces of physics. When the colony's chief scientist tried to understand what the boy was saying, he realized the child was explaining advanced concepts that human science hadn't even begun to explore. The pattern was consistent and terrifying in its scope. Human children between the ages of 5 and 13 were manifesting abilities that seemed to come from science fiction rather than real life. 9-year-old Park Subin on Titan could somehow see through solid objects and describe what was happening on the other side of the moon. 11-year-old Kim Hanul on the asteroid mining station had started creating small objects out of thin air, assembling matter at the molecular level with nothing but concentrated thought. Dr. Kim coordinated with human settlements across the galaxy, trying to understand what was happening to their children. The abilities were growing stronger by the hour, and parents were reporting that their kids seemed to know things they had never been taught. They spoke about distant planets they had never visited, described technologies that didn't exist, and demonstrated understanding of scientific principles that took adult researchers decades to master. But the awakening came with consequences that nobody had anticipated. The energy flowing through young human minds was creating ripples in the fabric of space-time itself. Around major human colonies, reality began showing stress fractures that looked like cracks in a broken mirror. Ships traveling through hyperspace. Near human settlements reported navigation errors and temporal distortions that threatened to tear their vessels apart. The situation became critical when the Mars colony reported that gravitational fields around their settlement were fluctuating wildly. Li Inha's growing abilities were somehow affecting the planet's gravitational relationship with its moons, creating tidal forces that threatened to destroy the carefully balanced ecosystem that terraforming engineers had spent decades creating. News of humanity's emerging abilities spread through the galactic community faster than the humans could control the information. Some alien species reacted with wonder and offered immediate assistance, hoping to learn from what they saw as humanity's incredible evolutionary leap. But others responded with fear and aggression that threatened to ignite the first galaxy-wide war in over 1,000 years. The Corthian Empire, a militaristic species that had always viewed humans as potential competitors, launched the first preemptive strike against the research station on Zerion 7. Their battle fleet arrived without warning, demanding that all human children be surrendered for protective custody, in what was obviously an attempt to weaponize the awakening abilities. Commander Thexel, despite his earlier amazement at human capabilities, found himself torn between his duty to protect the archaeological site and his growing fear of what humanity might become. "Your children are becoming gods," he told Dr. Kim during an emergency meeting. "What happens when they grow up? What happens when they decide they don't need the rest of us anymore?" Other alien factions took different approaches. The Morvani offered desperate alliances, hoping that partnership with humanity might protect them from whatever cosmic forces were awakening in human children. The Crystallites proposed joint research projects, believing that their silicon-based consciousness might be able to understand and help control the emerging powers. Through all of this chaos, Minho remained connected to the Prime Jewel, serving as a focal point for the awakening that was spreading across human space. But his role as a conduit was taking a terrible toll on his young body and mind. Dr. Kim watched in horror as her son began flickering in and out of normal reality, his physical form becoming translucent as he existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions. "Mom, I can feel all of them," Minho said during one of his brief moments of clarity. His voice carried harmonics from other dimensions, making it sound like multiple people speaking at once. "Every human child who's awakening, I can feel their confusion and their power. It's like a symphony, but the music is getting louder and more chaotic every minute." The boy's small body was struggling to contain forces that could reshape entire solar systems. Energy patterns danced around him like visible electricity, and sometimes his form would stretch and distort, as if he was being pulled in directions that didn't exist in normal three-dimensional space. "I can't control it," Minho admitted, tears streaming down his face as he fought to maintain his connection to ordinary reality. "There's too much knowledge trying to come through at once. All the things our ancestors knew, all the power they had, it wants to awaken in every human child simultaneously." Dr. Kim reached out to touch her son, but her hand passed through him as if he was made of light rather than flesh and blood. The ancient jewel pulsed with increasing intensity, and she realized that the artifact was trying to download millions of years of accumulated knowledge into human minds that weren't ready to receive it all at once. The dimensional fractures around human colonies were growing larger and more unstable. If the pattern continued, the awakening of human children might literally tear apart the fabric of space-time, destroying not just human civilization, but potentially unraveling the structure of reality itself throughout the local galaxy. Minho looked at his mother with eyes that held the wisdom of ages and the fear of a child who was in way over his head. "Something has to change, Mom. Either we find a way to control this power or it's going to destroy everything we're trying to protect. As the dimensional fractures continued spreading around human colonies and Minho's physical form flickered dangerously between realities, the solution came from an unexpected source. It wasn't the brilliant alien scientists with their advanced quantum computers, nor was it the human researchers desperately trying to understand the ancient technology. Instead, the answer emerged from the awakening children themselves, through a moment of pure intuitive understanding that only young minds could achieve. Minho, despite his body existing partially in multiple dimensions, suddenly felt a surge of clarity that cut through all the chaos and confusion. The ancient jewel had been trying to show him something important from the very beginning, but he had been too overwhelmed by the raw power to understand the deeper message. The artifact wasn't designed to create individual superhumans or to give one person godlike abilities. Instead, it was meant to awaken the collective potential of the entire human species. "I understand now," Minho whispered to his mother, his voice carrying across several dimensional planes simultaneously. "The power isn't supposed to be concentrated in just a few of us. Our ancestors never intended for individual humans to carry this much knowledge alone. They designed it to be shared among everyone." Using the quantum connection that the jewel had established between all awakening human children, Minho began reaching out across the galaxy. His consciousness expanded beyond the research station, beyond the planet Zerion 7, touching the minds of every human child who had begun manifesting the ancient abilities. On Mars' colony, Lee Inha felt his presence like a warm hand on her shoulder. On Europa, young Choi Daiho stopped speaking in mathematical formulas and smiled for the first time in days as he sensed Minho's comforting mental touch. The process that followed was unlike anything anyone had ever witnessed. Instead of trying to contain or control their individual powers, the human children began voluntarily sharing their abilities with each other. Lee Inha's gravitational manipulation skills flowed through the quantum network to dozens of other children, but instead of making them all equally powerful, the ability became distributed and manageable. Choi Daiho's mathematical understanding spread to other young minds, but each child received only the portion they could safely handle. Dr. Kim watched in amazement as her son's flickering form began to stabilize. The overwhelming energy that had been threatening to tear him apart was now flowing outward to thousands of other human children across the galaxy, creating a vast neural network that connected young minds in ways that transcended normal space and time. The dimensional fractures around human colonies began healing as the chaotic energy found balance through this collective harmony. But the most remarkable aspect of humanity's awakening wasn't the incredible powers the children now possessed. It was how they chose to use those abilities. Instead of seeking conquest or domination over the alien species who had once seemed so much more advanced, the human children responded with an explosion of empathy and wisdom that surprised everyone, including their own parents. 10-year-old Park Ji-won on the asteroid mining station used her newly awakened ability to manipulate matter at the molecular level to cure the Vorthak genetic plague that had been killing their species for over 3 centuries. She simply reached out through the quantum network and showed Vorthak scientists how to repair the damaged genetic sequences that caused their immune systems to attack their own bodies. 8-year-old Kim Min-seo on Titan Colony demonstrated how the silicon-based crystallites could reproduce without consuming their homeworld's crystalline core, a process that had been slowly destroying their planet for thousands of years. Through the shared human consciousness network, she taught them techniques for growing new crystal matrices using ambient cosmic radiation instead of depleting their finite planetary resources. The Morvani, beings of pure energy, who had struggled for millennia with telepathic storms that destroyed their own thoughts when they tried to communicate, received help from 11-year-old Choi Yuna. She showed them how to create harmonic barriers that allowed clear communication without the destructive interference patterns that had plagued their species since they first achieved consciousness. These acts of healing and assistance weren't planned or coordinated by any adult authority. The human children simply felt the suffering of other species through their expanded awareness and instinctively reached out to help. They approached each problem with the natural compassion and problem-solving creativity that children possess before the world teaches them to be suspicious or territorial. As Minho's connection to the prime jewel deepened and stabilized, he found himself standing at a threshold between dimensions where translucent figures of ancient humans waited patiently. These were his species' transcended ancestors, the beings who had achieved godlike powers millions of years ago, and then ascended to higher planes of existence. "We have been watching and waiting," said one of the ancient figures, her voice carrying the wisdom of eons but speaking with the warmth of a grandmother, addressing her beloved grandchild. "We left you the tools and the knowledge, encoded in your very genetics, but we could never predict how you would choose to use them." Another ancestral figure stepped forward, his form shimmering with colors that existed beyond the normal visible spectrum. "We achieved great power in our time, but we used it primarily for our own advancement and transcendence. You have done something we never accomplished. You have chosen to use your awakening abilities not for yourselves but to heal and help others." The ancient humans explained that humanity's response to their awakening had exceeded even their most optimistic expectations. The ancestors had feared that their descendants might repeat their own mistakes, using advanced abilities for conquest and domination. Instead, the human children had instinctively understood that true power comes not from what you can take or control, but from what you can give and heal. Across the galaxy, alien civilizations watched in wonder and growing respect, as humanity took its place among the stars not as conquerors but as cosmic gardeners. The human children used their inherited abilities to solve problems, heal ancient wounds, and create connections between species that had been enemies for thousands of years. The greatest power humanity had proven wasn't the ability to reshape matter or transcend dimensions. It was the wisdom to know when to share rather than hoard, when to heal rather than harm, and when to build bridges rather than walls. In choosing compassion over conquest, the newest awakened species in the galaxy had become its greatest teachers.